Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
All right, this impression has been painted with debubbleizing solution so that the surface tension will be reduced for the pouring of the well-mixed stone. Well-mixed stone has been mixed and is ready for the pouring of the die and model areas. A small amount of stone is placed initially, and this prepared tooth registration is located on this right side, and a straight pin with a sticky waxed junction to the dowel pin has been placed so that the dowel pin is suspended approximately or at least 2 millimeters above the area where the pulpal floor was in the cavity preparation. This will allow for enough thickness of the stone die beyond the cervical aspect of the preparation, as well as provide adequate base to the covering the neural portion of the dowel pin. A small amount of the stone is placed first and vibrated carefully along the palatal surface of the impression. And it begins to flow over the cervical aspect of that registration and into the occlusal aspect. And it's important that that stone be followed very carefully as it flows into the occlusal portion of the prepared cavity registration. In order to prevent entrapment of air. And as soon as that is visible and it is going across the occlusal portion, additional stone can be added. So that it flows across toward the buccal area. The most critical part here is the filling of the prepared tooth registration and the impression. As soon as the prepared tooth registration is filled, then a considerable amount of stone can be placed in the other areas of the impression. Again, in amounts that will permit vibrating and coverage of the occlusal areas without entrapment of air. When all of the teeth have been filled, and it's important to come back and be sure that the collar of the dowel pin is with the neural portion has been covered. Failure to completely submerge the knurled portion of the dowel pin would leave an area which would be included in the second pour of the stone later on, and the die then would be locked in position, and it would not be possible to remove it from the base. Now, when that portion of the pouring has been completed up to that level, then a few additional increments of stone are placed with this pour so that there will be a mechanical retention lock of the second pour of stone later on to this pour. It's important, though, to avoid the area where the die will be removed with these increments, and one here for the last molar, which would be retained with that second pour in the stone base. This will be allowed to set now until complete hardening has taken place, and then we'll have the second pour after lubrication and removal of the straight pin, lubrication of the die base area of this first initial pour. After the completion of the pouring of the yellow stone on the upper section of the impression, following the setting of the initially placed Velmic stone, we have a line of demarcation which shows the two kinds of stone, and then the entire model was separated from the impression. This prepared tooth or die part of this complete arts stone model. And so it's time now to take the saw blade and make a cut which would separate this die from the model. And the cuts will be made between the prepared tooth and the adjacent tooth to the distal, and the same between this and the tooth to the mesial. And these cuts will be carried from the interdental papilla area down through the Velmic stone portion of the model so that it may be separated. A separating solution has been placed in this area over the first poured stone mixture prior to the pouring of the yellow stone mixture, so that after these two are cut, then it would separate. Since the space between the distal aspect of the prepared tooth and the adjacent tooth, the second molar, is so limited, I'm going to use a very fine saw blade in that particular area. And this is going to be placed very carefully in order to avoid any contact with the prepared tooth. Now this cutting is taking place going toward the junction of the two kinds of stone, but also then will now assume an angle which will converge with the opposite section or opposite cut later. All right, now the first saw cut has been completed and is shown having been carried through the Velmic portion, Velmic stone portion of the model. Now using the a wider, a little heavier blade, since there is adequate space in the mesial aspect to use a larger blade, one which is more durable, then the same process will be carried out, cutting again in the mesial section down to the same depth. The two saw blade cuts now have been completed through the Velmic stone portion of the die down to the junction with the yellow stone. And it's possible to see that these two cuts do converge so that there is a taper formed to this die base, which will permit its removal and replacement. Now, turning the model over and protecting the die against the hand so that it does not bounce out and get damaged, we just tap this dowel pin end slightly to allow the removal of the die from the model. And there's a precaution to avoid getting any debris into the area of the model where the dowel pin is replaced so that prevention of seating of that die would take place in that event. Now the next operation is the trimming of the die in order to expose the entire finish lines of the prepared tooth die for the waxing procedure which will follow this. The Bard-Parker 25 blade is a sharp and well-pointed blade and most useful in doing this trimming procedure. And the object is to get underneath and trim far enough below so as to avoid any damage to the die and yet be able to expose the finish line portion of that preparation. So taking small increments around the die, we proceed to surround the entire die with the trimming procedure until the trimming is completed. The die has been trimmed completely around its circumference now, and all the finish lines of the preparation on this die have been exposed. So it's time to replace the trimmed die back into the maxillary model.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.